Thanks for joining us yet again, my peeps. Today, I have another special guest because I love you and I want to bring our connection. And we're connected with another special guest today who I know I'm looking forward to talking to her. So much so that my words are getting jumbled right now because I'm so excited. Okay, so she is the founder of the People Risk Consulting. She is an author of the Creating Critical Opportunity Workbook. She helps CEOs eliminate the hidden people risks that stall our transformation, right? So normally we talk a lot about emotional well-being outside of the corporate world. Well, today we're going back into the corporate world with my next guest. She has a doctorate. Oh my goodness, she has a doctorate in organizational change and leadership. She has a master's in communication management. She's smart, y'all. She's smart, y'all. Please help me welcome Dr. Diane Dye.
Welcome. Hi. So great to be on your show. I'm excited. I'm full of joy.
Good. I'm glad. So yes, so we talk a lot about joy and emotional well-being for parents and teachers and educators for the most part on this podcast. But as my listeners know, I personally bring that into the corporate world with my talks. So I would like to investigate that with you. But before we do that, I am very curious if you could share with us what people risk is.
You know, I have always been of the belief that all risk is human risk. And I started People Risk Consulting because organizations have the habit of looking straight to the legal department when they look at risk, where risk is actually a much broader ripple in the pond. There are innovation risks that will stall innovation in companies and a company won't be able to grow. There's educational risks where the employees within the organization have knowledge gaps, and rather than focusing on mastery, they focus on punitive actions for mistakes. Rather than focusing on learning from failure, they do write-ups. And that is a risk and a risky way to handle things like that. There are so many human risks within organizations that a company increases its risk profile when it doesn't take into consideration. I would think of legal as being reactive, whereas people risk in that framework is proactive. You get ahead of the problem, so the problem doesn't end up costing you time in being sued or in court. But not only that, is risk can be leveraged to create opportunity. Problems can be leveraged to create opportunity and increase revenue too. So that's what I help CEOs with.
Great. That's awesome. You know what? I'm going to send this recording to all the upper management for my day job. I work at Job Corps, and they need to know about the people risks, and they need to know how to be proactive, rather than their history is, legally, and they're government programs. So their history is dealing with the legal ramifications and, it's not necessarily preventing, it's not proactive. So they really need to hear this. that is so exciting. Gosh, there's so many questions going on in my brain. And I guess let's start with the first one is how would you, so you mentioned, for instance, the education gap with employees, how do you, excuse me, I have brain damage and sometimes I lose focus. And so I move around to get my focus back sometimes. So,
okay, good.
How would you approach a situation with an employee who doesn't have the education? How would you what advice would you give that CEO on how to take care of that?
Well, first, when you notice a gap, it's usually because something has gone wrong. And mistakes or some sort of failure is one of the first indicators that you may or may not have a gap. And so I say may or may not because the gap actually falls in one of three areas. It can fall in knowledge, it can fall in motivation, or it can fall in organizational support. And knowing which bucket that is really important. And I know we have a lot of educators on this podcast as well listening. And there's a lot of parallels between being a superintendent of a school district or being a principal of a school and being the CEO of an organization. So when you look at your organization strategically, you want to, and I'll just bring it right back down to that single employee. You want to first set the stage. You want to set the environment for the conversation. And the first thing you're going to say is there is no punishment for failure in this conversation. My goal is to help us learn from what happened and not to assign blame or shame or anything related to that, but help me understand. That is the most powerful phrase a leader can use, by the way, is help me understand. And then you want to follow that up with any question prefix except for why. Reason you don't say why is because why is very emotional. Why will create an emotional spiral. I will ask you why 7 times, you will cry, and you will go all the way back to your childhood trauma. But if you say what, now you're getting to data. Now you're getting information. What, where, how, when. Now you're starting to get some specifics to understand if there is a gap. So as a leader, what you're doing at that point is you're conducting a gap analysis between what the organization expects the employee to know and what they actually do know. Mm-hmm. And the gap between what they do know and what the organization expects is a mastery curve. And there are steps along the way to getting what the organization expects. And it depends on the role and how complex that mastery curve is. But when you approach it that way, you can actually create a plan of action that's going to make sense for that employee. It's the same thing when you're developing your leaders, employees. It doesn't matter where they sit on the rank and file spectrum. When you understand the gap versus assume the gap, you get the result. So being able to ask those questions is incredibly important. So you have to set that stage. You have to set that environment of non-judgment, openness, transparency. I conducted my dissertation on women who were experiencing domestic violence at home, and they were struggling in the workplace. And when they struggled in the workplace, they had these leaders that were psychologically safe. They approached them in this way that I just said, with transparency, openness, non-judgment, great questions. They'd go on walks to have conversations. And what they were able to do is not only discover that performance gap and create mastery, improving the outcome of that employee, they were also able to provide accommodations that kept the organization and the employee safe. I'll give you an example. One of the stories in my dissertation was qualitative, so story-driven. One of the situations, the woman's husband was tracking her car, and she used her car for company business. And so she would go and meet accounts in her car, and the abuser would follow her and start altercations at customer accounts. So this is a company problem now. It took a personal problem and it then became a big company problem. Right. With that disclosure, that leader was able to get that employee a company car. So now the car was at work. He didn't know about the company car. She was able to do her business and perform well and be in a state of mind that wasn't always looking over her shoulder, wondering if her abuser was going to attack her at the next appointment or come at her for some reason. So without this openness, this transparency, this non-judgment, this piece, what happens is situations like this and not as serious as this, just basic failure, they get covered up. And they get covered up because it's easier to save face in the face of fear of reprisal, losing your job, being seen as incompetent, all the things that the mind begins to tell us. In my study situation, just pile on top of that the woman was experiencing abuse at home, right? So that's magnified. And I know this situation intimately because that was me. I was that woman, and I did not have that leader. And I was curious how, if at all, performance was improved. These careers were saved because the typical outcome for this woman is low performance, resulting in losing her job, resulting in the financial instability, so she cannot leave her relationship, mental health issues, behavioral health issues. It's not a pretty story for the women who are experiencing this. But when a leader, and it even just takes one, who can do that, an organization that has a innovative mindset, one that says, oh, well, we don't have this in place. But another example from the dissertation is there was a woman whose husband was not letting her stay late at work. And her leader said, come over here. I'm going to take a picture with you by the clock so he can see we're still working. He had that woman and her supervisor take a picture every 30 minutes, and that supervisor did it. But what happened is she felt the woman who was experiencing this felt safe. She felt seen. She was able to perform, which is what all organizations want. And the risk was mitigated because he didn't show up at the workplace. Mm-hmm. Abusers call, they show up, they stalk, they do all sorts of things that threaten the workplace. So when you look at risk, I encourage you, where they're, parent, educator, executive, to look at it through that human lens, because it's so important. And it's so important to be willing to be innovative, to be proactive in creating solutions for these problems versus seeing it as another checkbox to send to HR.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right. I found the basis of this story, which is you made a lot of wonderful points. And the one point that I attached to, because it bridges what you're talking about to what we talk about here on this podcast, which is play and laughter and applied improv, is communication. communication and how the supervisor communicates. And that's so important. That sets the stage to everything else, right? So all of your points about the atmosphere and creating this safe, welcoming, productive atmosphere that all begins with communication. And I'm not going to ask you this because I already know what you're going to say, so I'm not going to waste your time or waste the audience's time either, because we're on the same mindset, and I know that you think, just from what I've heard, that you would agree that play, this all adds to that creative, fun atmosphere, and it's that is more we're safer. There are less. We have less emotional problems that way, and and just we're more productive too. I'm sorry. I'm now.
Yeah. No, absolutely. You're hitting the nail on the head, Malcolm. You're hitting the nail on the head, and I have a term for it, and I call it joy space.
Joy space.
So, what to me joy space is it's playing in the space where time does not exist. It's that one space where you're doing the deal, but you're having so much fun with it, right? You're having so much fun with the work or with the conversation or with whatever. The time just flies. It ceases to exist at that point. And that is when, and others call it flow state, but it is that joy in being in the zone.
I kind of like this interview, by the way. Kind of like this interview.
I like this interview too.
So yeah, it's joy space. But anyway, I'm sorry, I just had to interrupt you for that. But please go on with what you're saying.
Yeah. So studies have shown that when people are joyful at work, when they are happy at work, Gallup's study shows when individuals have a best friend at work, they are 5 times more likely to be retained in an organization. And I can't tell you how many times I've gotten pushback on putting that in an employee survey, but it's the absolute truth, is that when you cultivate an environment of joy and not performative joy, there is a difference between performative joy and real joy. And being allowed to be yourself in your full authenticity, in your full acceptance, and full inclusion, and pass the cake at the birthday party, Office Space style. I don't know if you use video in podcast, but if you do, and even now, I'll send a screenshot to your listeners. There's an Office Space poster right behind this shoulder right here.
I noticed that.
And that's part of the reason why I started my firm, right? And I lived in Austin, where Office Space was filmed. But there's a little bit of Office Space in every organization. And for those younger individuals listening to this podcast, Office Space is a must-watch, a Gen X classic office movie. But it's not boring. It's hilarious. And some of the jokes still hit and some of them don't. But it was created by Mike Judge, who created King of the Hill and Beavis and Butthead. And it really shows what happens when an organization is just so rote on what they expect, and they have no room for joy. They have no room for authenticity. And in fact, you could show up for work 2 hours a day and totally, be a top performer. And that's what happens in organizations that aren't joyful and people aren't purpose-driven, is they literally quiet quit on the job, but they can stay there for years, working 2 hours a day. But I don't think that should be our norm. I don't think that should be our norm and our standard at all. Viewing a workforce workplace as a micro community is such a great approach. But here's the problem in with CEO isolation and 77% of CEOs working alone is that the CEOs don't have their model. They don't have their joyful cohort. And I like to call it cohort because that's what I have had throughout my life. I've been blessed to have these small groups of individuals that have literally been my ride or die, cheer me on, lift me up, not push me down, wind in my wings kind of groups. And I got my first one from the University of Southern California where I went to school. But when executives have that, they bring a greater joy to their workplaces because most CEOs are amazing visionaries. And from that vision sometimes can also come dark vision. It can look at AI, and it can look at all the things that are happening in the world and tariffs and this and that and the other. And it can paint a pretty nasty picture. And that's an even nastier picture if you're facing it alone. But when you have a cohort, when you have people to walk together with, you can walk together in joy. But you have to intentionally walk together in joy because there's a whole other cohort and they are looking to have people co-sign their breakdown and have people agree that everything is all messed up. And they're having people complain and they form little toxic groups that are joining forces with hate. So it's a better option to isolate from people like that, even though it's a behavior that's still going to result in lack of innovation. So when executives have this model that they can walk with, it is so transformative and the joy trickles down.
You mentioned one thing. I want to mention this for the sake of the viewers, our listeners, or both actually, because it is video.
Awesome.
Yes. So other people like you based on how you make them feel when they're with you. So going way back to what you were saying about, you were talking about the the groups, in having our own cohort. That's something to think about. Again, with joy, when you're joyful, when you're having fun, then people are going to want to be with you and want to be in your cohort and everything else. Oh my gosh, Dr. Diane, we are having so much fun. I thoroughly enjoy this time. And unfortunately, it's coming to a close. I want to have you back because I want to have a much longer conversation.
Absolutely. Let's do it.
All of us. But this is our close for Potapalooza Day. And so I would like to ask you, do you have any final words of wisdom?
Absolutely. I think we're all products of our environments. And some of us haven't had the best examples in how to bring that joy. So to those who find themselves listening and have been in that situation, step up and be the model. Be willing to unlearn what you think you know. Find your cohort. And if you need help, connect with me on LinkedIn and DM me the word cohort, and I'll invite you to my masterclass and introduce you to some new people that'll lift you up.
And that's a perfect bridge to what I was going to say next is tell us how we can get a hold of you.
LinkedIn is great. I am on all of the social channels. So I go live in the masterclass and a masterclass webinar every Monday. And so that's when those take place with a different topic every Monday. And you can also go to peopleriskconsulting.com. But if you want to be one of those academic types, because I know there's a lot listening, you want to read my dissertation, go to drdianedye.com. You can just scroll down at the bottom, click on it. It'll take you to the USC library where my dissertation lives under the name Barbara Diane Hansen.
Okay, there's a big story there that you have to wait for, and stay tuned next time Dr. Diane Dye comes on the Lighten Up Project. So anyway, Dr. Diane, I want to thank you very, very much for this very stimulating conversation. I can't wait for our next one. Listeners, I want to thank you for tuning in yet again. We can do this without you. And please keep tuning in. I'll see you next time. Bye. Stressed out, stuck, or leading on autopilot? It's not a motivational problem. It's a connection problem. My weekly virtual improv classes boost engagement, collaboration, and retention, all while having fun. Register now for a complimentary month.